Transferring techniques from the laboratory into the field is precisely what scientists were trying to do at the turn of the last century. Bell credits his former student with having, quote, an imagination capable of weaving a theory or piecing together a broken chain or unraveling a tangled clue. Such are the implements of his trade to a successful diagnostician, end quote. Bell here is making it clear that Holmes' awe-inspiring process is precisely what Bell expected of all his students and happens to be what those investigating crime should do as well. Textbooks of the time had detailed descriptions of how to examine a corpse, whether at the scene or at the morgue. Furthermore, they had instructions on how to consider blood spatter as Holmes does. The standard text at most British universities was the Principles and Practices of Medical Jurisprudence by Alfred Swain Taylor, a chemistry professor at Guy's Hospital in London. Although Taylor died in 1880, the text was already in its 10th edition by then and would be updated by others posthumously. In it, Taylor walked students through what were then the best practices of crime scene investigation, often including illustrations of how murder victims might be positioned that were based on real cases. In the 1873 edition, Taylor explains that the strongest evidence of homicide is often found in the attitude and the state of the dress of the dead body. It may or may not indicate interference or change after death, irreconcilable with the supposition of death from suicide or accident. On this point, the minutest circumstance may become of considerable importance as medical evidence. Such commentary was typical, and the amount of detail used is not unlike Conan Doyle's own writing style when Holmes breaks down the evidence for his assembled audience. Looking at a page from the Edinburgh University calendar from the academic year 1879 and 80, which you'll find on the digital handout, we can see the examination questions asked of medical jurisprudence students the previous year, about half of which were about bloodstains. Whether Conan Doyle sat that particular exam, I do not know, but it does indicate the specificity expected of medical students when he was there. Additionally, he may have taken extramural forensic classes at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, a common occurrence at that time. In 1883, an Aberdeen University professor compiled examination questions from around Britain, making it clear that such knowledge was standard everywhere. With respect to crime scenes particularly, question number 1 in that text asks students to identify if a dead body was a victim of violence. Question number 2 asks what stains might be mistaken for blood. And question number 5 specifies how one could recognize blood on weapons and articles of clothing. In considering all of these potential sources of clues and stories, Holmes educated the readers and Scotland Yard personnel on what each meant and what must not be overlooked. In A Study in Scarlet, Holmes is pleased when Tobias Gregson realizes that the blood and writing on the wall might be tricks to throw the police onto the wrong scent, something Conan Doyle's professors would have also pointed out. As Bell notes, quote, trained as he had been to notice and appreciate minute detail, Dr. Doyle saw how he could interest his intelligent readers by taking them into his confidence and showing his mode of working, unquote. There is always a question of how smart the men in Scotland Yard are relative to Holmes, but readers who successfully figured out the clues placed before them by Conan Doyle would certainly have felt smart by the time the murderer was revealed. When another body is found in Chapter 7 of A Study in Scarlet, thanks to a little red ribbon of blood which had meandered across the passage and formed a little pool along the skirting at the other side, it enables Holmes to confirm theories he had after viewing the first crime scene, because this evidence is fresher. The distinction between old and recent stains is essential in criminal cases, for it gives a detective an idea of how long ago a crime was committed, and there is less likelihood the blood has been contaminated with other substances. Interestingly, Conan Doyle would be called out on some inaccurate storytelling with respect to dried blood soon after he resurrected Holmes. In his 1904 story, The Adventure of the Second Stain, Conan Doyle erroneously stated that a blood stain, which was several days old, was crimson in color. A contributor to the medical press and circular caught the inaccuracy and scolded both the fictional characters of Holmes and Watson, along with Conan Doyle, who, quote, must have seen some bloodstains during his South African experiences, even if he has quite forgotten his student days, unquote. The stain in question is the titular second stain that's underneath a rug at the crime scene. The blood, in this case, winds up indicating motive rather than cause of death, and enables Holmes to figure out who the culprit was despite the mistaken terminology. The return of Sherlock Holmes came amidst a flurry of discussion in scientific circles about the use of blood in murder investigations, after an assistant professor at the Institute of Hygiene in Greifswald, Germany, announced a new test to be used on blood evidence. In an article by an anonymous writer in the Illustrated Scientific News in March 1903, entitled simply "The Blood Test," the author starts it by saying, quote, it is sometimes still asserted, usually by novelists, that there is no test for human blood which can be depended on, though Mr. Sherlock Holmes was said to have found a chemical test, unquote. The author then proceeds to explain the newly discovered bacteriological test before concluding it was still not possible to distinguish the blood of one person for another, limiting the helpfulness of the breakthrough. The majority of the Holmes stories published in the Strand in 1903 and 4 featured bloody crime scenes, perhaps intending to capitalize on the heightened scientific focus. Quickly considering 4 other stories published in 1904, in The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, there is blood on an oak chair. In The Adventure of Black Peter, there is blood on a notebook. In The Adventure of the Priory School, there is blood splatter on the front of a bicycle that corresponds with some found on flowering gorse and heather along a path. And in The Adventure of the Six Napoleons, the murder victim is described as having a great gash in his throat and the whole place swimming in blood. It may be fair to say that Conan Doyle believes such evidence is what would sell best, it being more visually descriptive after the fact than poison or suffocation as a means of murder. There's also a sense that he was trying to outdo himself from one story to the next, possibly with an innate understanding that readers might become desensitized to the descriptions of violence the more crime stories they read. The scene in Six Napoleons may be the most bloody. Certainly Conan Doyle chose to express it in large terms, there being a pool of blood next to the victim that the presumed murder weapon, a knife, was lying in. Then when there is a suspect in custody, a search of his clothing revealed a long sheath knife, the handle of which bore copious traces of recent blood. I do find that phrasing slightly strange. It makes me envision lots of small drops of blood which have recently dried. In reading these stories, we see that the slip in second stain with respect to the color of the blood appears to be just that, a mistake. In Priory School, those flowering plants were dotted with dark stains of clotted blood. So Conan Doyle did remember that fresh blood is crimson and it darkens over time. What struck me as I went through the stories again is the overall lack of blood evidence Conan Doyle chose to have on clothing. In the majority of cases, it's found on furniture, portable objects, or simply in the room itself, floors, walls, windowsills, and the like. I believe one reason for this may be the emphasis in every edition of Taylor's text disabusing students of the assumption that a murderer will be covered in blood after a violent crime. As it's stated most succinctly in the 1905 edition, assailant need not be bloody. It may also be that Conan Doyle thought it was too simple a way to connect the dots in his stories, that it would not display Holmes' brilliance sufficiently. As William Franklin Watson, an expert on microscopy at Furman University in South Carolina, wrote in an article in 1906, by the examination of a blood-spattered surface, one does not need to be a Sherlock Holmes to determine pretty accurately the direction of fall of the drops and the distance from which they came. It is something everyone could apply common sense to, enabling armchair detectives to identify whodunit. Scholars mentioning Holmes was quite common in medical journals, and it was not too long before his detection skills made their way into a variety of medical textbooks too, essentially bringing everything in a full intellectual circle. To provide 2 examples, in 1908, E. Wallace Hoare of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons encouraged students to adopt a modified form of the Sherlock Holmes method of investigation in his text on veterinary therapeutics and pharmacology. Then in 1920, Alfred P. Matthews, a professor of biochemistry at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, cites Holmes' expertise on the clotting of blood in his Physiological Chemistry, a textbook and manual for students. To unravel this tangled skein and to solve the mystery of the coagulation of the blood, We must adopt the methods employed by Holmes in his stories. The unavoidable drawback to this interplay between medical men in academia and a medical man who wrote crime fiction was the constant pressure on Conan Doyle to keep up with medical advances, particularly in medical jurisprudence. In the 1910s and 20s, reliable tests would finally exist to determine at a crime scene if blood was human. Sadly, he would not live to see the discovery of blood groups applied to crime solving in the 1930s. As with earlier forensic innovations, each of these would need to withstand repeated scientific scrutiny and then be explained in less scientific terms to judges and juries. And in this final respect, Conan Doyle's contributions cannot be overstated. For people who had read his stories were used to such exposition. The fictional stories thereby increased the efficacy of the stories presented in courtrooms, because that is the very thing Conan Doyle trained readers to expect from the moment he introduced them to Sherlock Holmes. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And yeah, full of really intriguing information. I'm just trying to stop spotlighting you. Yeah, as always, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, which you can indicate when the time comes by raising your hands or dropping comments into the chat. We will now move on to Elizabeth Dice and Lowell T. Fry, who are respectively Elliott Professor Emerita and Elliott Professor Emeritus of Rhetoric and Humanities at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, where they spent many years teaching, writing, and literature, especially 19th century British literature. Dice has published essays on Caroline Norton and Olive Schreiner. She has written extensively on the theme of marriage in the novels of George Meredith, and has published an edition with critical introduction and commentary entitled George Meredith's 1895 collection of 3 stories. Fry has written on the historical novel and the ghost story, and has published essays on the work of Thomas Carlyle. The two of them co-authored British Travellers and the Condition of America Question, Defining America in the 1830s, and this appeared in 19th Century British Travellers in the New World, which was published by Ashgate in 2013. Their interest in detective fiction and in Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories extends throughout their careers as teachers and scholars. And this afternoon they're going to be talking about disentangling the most inextricable mysteries, transformational clues in the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I believe you have a PowerPoint you'd like to share as well.
I got that. Thank you, James. And ours is a tag team presentation. I'll go first and then halfway through switch over to Lowell. Our focus today in discussing the narrative strategies in Sherlock Holmes stories is the clues in these stories. And I will begin by describing what we are calling a transformational clue. This clue crystallizes a pattern that reveals to Holmes the solution to the crime that is the focus of the work, restructuring in his and the reader's mind the events that preceded the discovery. Examining how Holmes recognizes and responds to transformational clues adds a layer of complexity to his character that is significant and too often overlooked. As a number of other presenters have noted, when we talk about narrative strategy in Sherlock Holmes stories and novels, it is useful first to turn to the now classic concepts of story and plot, as those terms were defined by Tsvetan Todorov in the 1960s, with story representing events that comprise the crime itself, and plot referring to the actions of the detective. However, in contradiction to Todorov's view that, quote, in their purest form, these stories, which is to say the two narrative lines of story and plot, have no point in common, we argue that transformational clues do bring these two narrative lines together, so that Holmes's investigation turns onto the right track and the reader, albeit usually later in the work, can follow Holmes's train of thought and at least begin to see the truth about how the crime was committed. I will give brief descriptions of some of these clues in particular stories, but first I'd like to elaborate on the nature of what we call transformational clues. In so doing, an aspect of Doyle's personal history is worth remembering. As everyone here at this conference undoubtedly knows, in preparing for a medical career, Doyle eventually opted for a specialization in ophthalmology. Hence, he had special knowledge of and interest in seeing and perception. It is possible to trace to this part of Doyle's background the distinction Holmes frequently makes in the stories between seeing and observing, a distinction that exists on the boundary between physiology and philosophy of mind, and one embodied in what we have called, or what have been called, visual paradoxes or gestalt shifts. In 1888, just a few years before Doyle went to study ophthalmology in Vienna, an optical illusion of the visual paradox variety appeared on a German postcard. It has since become known as The Beauty and the Hag, and you may be well familiar with it. It'll come up in a moment in the PowerPoint. There we go. This image, which is a single picture that can be seen as portraying two different individuals, the beauty, the young woman beauty looking away, and the hag, older woman looking down, was later adapted by British cartoonist William Ely Hill, who published it in a humor magazine in 1915. Another visual paradox, The Duck and the Rabbit, was published in Germany in 1892. We'll get it up in a minute. There we go. 1892, indicating an ongoing interest in early 20th century Europe in observation and perception. Whether or not Doyle himself saw these images, and I can't help but think that he did, he undoubtedly shared this interest, creating Holmes with an especially keen ability to see and interpret images, objects, people, even actions in various ways. Those who study perception, and I would certainly include the philosopher Wittgenstein in this group, have found that not everyone has the ability to interpret a single image in different ways, or at least that it takes some people longer than others to see the double subjects in the single image. So we offer this visual paradox as in both the concept and the ability it represents as a touchstone for our idea of the transformational clue. Now I turn to the examples of these clues in Doyle's works. These examples show the variety among types of transformational clues in the stories, but also show the similarity in their function. In Hound of the Baskervilles, there is, at least to my mind, an uncanny parallel between the beauty and the hag paradox, and the way that Holmes views the portrait of Sir Hugo Baskerville. Holmes sees in this portrait both the 17th century Hugo Baskerville and his descendant, the 20th century Jack Stapleton. This portrait is the transformational clue in the novel. It triggers the convergence of the storyline and the plot line by prompting a reassessment of Stapleton's actions, thus making the pieces of the mystery fall into a new pattern that eventually reveals the truth underlying the events in the novel's plot. You could take that off. In The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, Holmes sees a similarity between two human ears that triggers his reassessment of the mysterious events in the work. After examining the packaging and contents of a cardboard box sent to Miss Susan Cushing, and then examining Susan Cushing's own ear, Holmes sees the similarities in the ears that leads him to the conclusion that one of the ears in the box had belonged to Susan's sister. This realization leads to his ability to explain other clues and rework the narrative storyline of the crime. In some stories, the interpretation of an object serves as a transformational clue. For example, in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, it is the bell pull hanging by the side of the bed that triggers Holmes's reassessment of the situation. Holmes, Watson, and Helen Stoner, the young lady whose sister Julia has died suddenly, all recognize that the bell pull they are looking at in the bedroom is simply a rope nailed to the ceiling near an air vent. It is clearly not attached to a bell. Nevertheless, all but Holmes go on referring to the rope as a bell pull. It is Holmes's ability to see a double purpose, a dual identity of sorts for the rope that allows him to conclude eventually that Dr. Roylott, Helen's stepfather, has trained the deadly snake to use the rope to slither down onto the bed and bite the person sleeping there. To solve this mystery, Holmes has to recognize the fact that the rope looks like a bell pull, but is actually serving a different purpose. This recognition is the catalyst for other realizations that allow Holmes to solve this mystery. In some stories, Holmes draws upon his vast store of arcane knowledge to see a second meaning or purpose in a particular clue, as he does when he realizes that the small footprint he finds in the attic dust in the sign of 4 could have been made by one of the unusually small natives of the Andaman Islands instead of having been made by a child, which is Watson's explanation. Finally, in Silver Blaze, the transformational clue is a moment of silence, the moment Mark Haddon highlights in the title of his novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. In this case, the fact that a dog did not bark helps Holmes identify John Straker as a criminal, since he is the horse trainer who was known by the dog. Paradoxically, the dog's silence speaks to Holmes and rearranges his and the reader's understanding of the story's events. To sum up then, Sherlock Holmes finds and captures wrongdoers by finding and interpreting clues. At some point, there is one clue that turns and reframes Holmes's understanding of what has happened. Recognition of the clue's significance requires Holmes to see things literally and often figuratively in new ways, like making the visual intellectual shift from seeing the beauty to seeing the hag. These moments of recognition on Holmes's part lead him to reassess all the pieces of the mystery and to adjust his theories to fit the facts that he has observed. Other characters in the stories, notably including the Scotland Yard detectives who appear in most of the works, have in many cases constructed a narrative of the crime that relies on assumptions based on social prejudices related to gender, race, and class. It is Holmes's determination to keep an open mind, a necessary aspect of his analytical method, that allows him to see clues in 2 or more ways. On the one hand, Holmes's cold objectivity prevents his understanding of a wide range of emotional motives that can lead people to commit crimes. But that objectivity is also a key to his ability to see the world clearly and to develop a multifaceted interpretation of what he sees.
In the Sherlock Holmes stories, the clue and its transformation in Holmes's mind become Watson's narrative challenge. Following the adventure itself, Watson must decide how to unspool the transformative event that occurs in Holmes's mind so as to create a story rather than a police report or a newspaper account. From outside the frame of the case, a clue may seem a stable thing, an object like the rope in the Speckled Band or the portrait of Hugo Baskerville. Indeed, in The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge, even Inspector Gregson thinks of clues as inert objects. "You have a clue?" he asks Holmes, as if a clue were merely something one possesses. But clues have a complicated existence. A clue is a sign as well as a thing, and signs by their nature are not stable. They need to be interpreted. They have meaning only within a context. A clue may become clear to someone like Holmes, who has the rare ability to see both the duck and the rabbit in the same image. But even for Holmes, understanding a clue is a transformative process, a movement through time during which a train of thoughts runs through his mind so swiftly that he arrives, quote, at the conclusion without being conscious of intermediate steps. The rest of us are tangled in ambiguity and ambivalence because, as Holmes says of Watson, you see, but you do not observe. Because objects for most of us do not oscillate between possible meanings, they do not exist for us as clues, but merely as things. From this perspective, a potential clue means little in itself. A rope is just a rope, unless it can be placed within an interpretive context, revealing the rope to be masquerading as a bell pull. In other words, a thing can only be a clue, can only be a sign, if there is a human interpreter able to recognize its multivalent possibilities. As we explore the nature of a clue, it's helpful to consider the etymology of the English word itself. According to the OED, the word clue, first spelled C-L-E-W, originally referred to a globular body, a ball, especially an agglomerated ball formed by winding thread or yarn into a sphere. But the word soon acquired figurative meanings that obscured and then mostly erased its original sense. By the late 14th century, the word clue had become an English equivalent for the ball of thread that Ariadne gives to Theseus so that he might find his way into the center of the labyrinth, kill the Minotaur, and then find his way out. Understood figuratively, a clue is a unitary thing, a ball of yarn or thread that must be unraveled or unwound in order to lead one through a maze of perplexity or difficulty. A clue, thus, is something that puts one on the track of discovery, if one has the sense to recognize and unwind it. Elizabeth has already noted clues that are transformational with respect to Holmes's understanding of a case. Such clues are not mere pieces of evidence that Inspector Gregson might pick up. Instead, they are transformational because they allow Holmes to extricate understanding from the labyrinth that constitutes a case. In A Scandal in Bohemia, Watson notes admiringly of Holmes, there was something in his masterly grasp of a situation and his keen, incisive reasoning which made it a pleasure to me to follow the quick, subtle methods by which he disentangled the most inextricable mysteries. That is, Watson admires Holmes's ability to enter a labyrinth, unwind a ball of yarn so as to reach and neutralize the monstrous center, and then return to the outer world. Watson's words are telling. To disentangle something is to unravel a knot, to smooth out its intricacies so that the beginning and end of the string are visible. But Watson's words also highlights Holmes's peculiar genius. First, only Holmes has the insight to pick up the right string from a tangle of possible leads. And second, if something is inextricable, it is by definition completely resistant to being disentangled. A mystery that is inextricable is one that cannot be solved. Holmes's paradoxical ability to disentangle the inextricable seems almost magical and is the source of Watson's great admiration for Holmes. Throughout the Holmes canon, though Watson is unstinting in his praise of Holmes's genius as a detective, Holmes himself has difficulty recognizing Watson's talents as a writer. And though Watson rarely tells Holmes so to his face, Holmes has his own weaknesses, including an inability to understand and to appreciate what narrative is and does. Just as Holmes has an uncanny ability to recognize the transformational clue and to follow the clue into and out of a mystery, so Watson has a similarly unusual ability to pick up Holmes's clue, the balled up process by which Holmes has solved the case, and unspool it in a way that informs and delights his readers. Holmes disdains fiction because it transforms what he considers a world of facts into a species of romance. At the start of The Sign of Four, he rebukes Watson's narrative of A Study in Scarlet because he says, quote, detection is or ought to be an exact science and should be treated in the same cold and unemotional manner. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism. When Watson objects that, quote, the romance was there, I could not tamper with the facts, Holmes rouses Watson's annoyance by saying that, quote, some facts should be suppressed. Elsewhere in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, Holmes complains that Watson embellishes the cases unacceptably. Rather than focusing solely on Holmes's logical methods, Watson has, quote, degraded what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales. You have erred perhaps in attempting to put color and life into each of your statements instead of confining yourself to the task of placing upon record that severe reasoning from cause to effect, which is really the only notable feature about the thing. Though Watson does not defend himself in The Copper Beeches, he does so implicitly in the introduction to The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb, where he objects to the sort of bloodless report that Holmes prefers. Quote, the story of the engineer's severed thumb has, I believe, been told more than once in the newspapers, but like all such narratives, its effect is much less striking when set forth en bloc in a single half column of print than when the facts slowly evolve before your own eyes and the mystery clears gradually away as each new discovery furnishes a step which leads on to the complete truth. Certainly, Sherlock Holmes has a genius for disentangling knotty problems. He knows human beings to the extent that he can quantify and measure and to some extent predict their behavior. He can disentangle inextricable mysteries in what seems like an instant. But he doesn't know how to read people as Watson does. He does not know how to transform his own actions into something that readers might enjoy. To be fair, readers' enjoyment is of no interest to him. Holmes is a detective, not a storyteller. Thomas Carlyle once vocalized the problem that a writer of historical narrative must face. Quote, narrative is linear, action is solid. That is, the transformation of actions into words is a complicated business. As a detective, Sherlock Holmes is a master of action, but he knows virtually nothing of narrative. Thank goodness for John Watson and his ability to transform lectures into tales, to infuse his tales with color and life. He sees that a detective's work and writing engaging account of that detective's work are two distinct things. What makes Holmes a great detective makes him unsuited as a narrator of his own cases. Watson cannot solve the mysteries. He cannot recognize the ball of yarn that leads Holmes to the center of the labyrinth, but he knows how to narrate such mysteries, how to transmute a block of actions into a compelling narrative that enthralls an audience. And of course, the long partnership of Holmes and Watson, detective and narrator, reveals clearly to us that the writer who created them both, Arthur Conan Doyle, knew what he was doing. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was really wonderful, and I particularly enjoyed the etymology of the word clue. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. we're now going to move on to our final speaker of the panel, Josephine Sharoni, who was awarded her PhD in 2015 at the University of Kent. Josephine is an independent scholar working at the intersection of Lacanian theory and literature, and the author of Lacan and Fantasy Fiction, which was published by Brill in 2017. Josephine, you're going to be speaking on The Lost World and the Critique of Modernity. Please take it away.
Hi, so can you hear me and can you see the slides?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah, and see the slides.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about one particular work about Arthur Conan Doyle that's been brought up quite a few times in this conference. It's The Lost World, his novel from 1912. And it's been brought up in the context of him being a great storyteller, and it's a great yarn. And in the end, I want to make a point that I think actually is quite similar to one that was made by Professor Clausen in this conference. And I think I'm going to get roughly to the same point, but maybe a different route. And that is the difference between the tale, which is a great tale and it's resolved very satisfactorily, and something beyond the tale, which and something to do with Conan Doyle's artistry, which opens up a lot more questions and problems that are kind of outside the tale. So the first thing I want to argue is that actually this novel should be seen in the context of a number of other novels that appear, starting with 1887 with She, and there is an allusion to She in the novel, The Lost World, and also include another short story by Arthur Conan Doyle. And what I want to argue is that these works of literature kind of roughly share the same plot, and that this plot is at its most succinct in a paragraph, appears in Freud's Totem and Taboo, which is why that's there. And it very basically reads like once there was a kind of horde of 8 men, and ruled over by a despotic primal father who keeps all the women to himself. And one day the sons rise against him and kill him and share out the women a bit more from then on, a bit more equitably. Now the point is that Freud's tale occurs, is set at some kind of the dawn of human time. It seems to be some attempt to explain how human culture comes into being from no culture or from the animal world, whereas these tales are set, they appear in late 19th century Britain, and I'd argue they're set in 19th century Britain. What appears in these tales is some kind of device, I would argue, that enables the primal father to reappear at the end of the 19th century in a very advanced country, which is Great Britain. And that both in She and The Lost World, we have this kind of far-flung piece of the globe, which kind of makes us think of the British Empire, but I'd argue it's actually a kind of way of creating this space where a lawless primal father can appear, and that we can see a device, another way of doing this, so to speak, is you say an invisible man, where some kind of completely fictional science is invented by the author, that of having an invisible man, and Conan Doyle himself uses some kind of a fictional advance in aviation, which hadn't occurred when this story, The Horror of the Heights, appeared in 1913. And we have the appearance of Dracula in London, which arguably is the primal father figure there. Stoker's made use of some traditional folk mythology. Now, the point is, okay, here I think we have what is obviously some kind of, or it reminds us of Freud's primal horde, is appears on the South American plateau, where 4 Englishmen go to try to find proof that dinosaurs still exist. And there appears this horde of ape-like figures, and there is in fact a chief, despotic chief, and in the end the 4 Englishmen managed to kill the chief. But the point is that, and this point is made twice in the novel, so we can't miss it, that Challenger, the scientist, and the kind of head of the expedition, seems to the other members of the expedition to be the exact double of this chief of the ape-men. And this is Rostand's remark, you know, this old ape-man, he was their chief, and he was a sort of red challenger with every one of our friends' beauty points, only just a trifle more so. So the question which arises is, why Challenger, a scientist, why is he the double of this totally primordial, primitive, despotic ape-man who can barely speak? So why? Okay, this is so this is a quote from Challenger himself at the beginning of the story, when he claims that that dinosaurs still exist and that he has proof of them, and not surprisingly, he's challenged, and he comes up with this report that when great facts are laid before you, meaning those who are challenging him, you have not the intuition, the imagination, which would help you understand them. You can only throw mud at the men, and you persecute the prophets, Galileo, Darwin, and I. Okay, so we can see this as, Challenger is insufferable, and the novel has a lot of fun at his expense. But there's something odd about this, because in the end, of course, we don't need any intuition or imagination to understand what Challenger's saying. He's simply saying dinosaurs exist, and in the end, he brings an actual dinosaur, albeit a baby one, and shows it to the doubters. So they don't need any imagination; they see it with their own eyes. Okay, so this is odd, but the thing is, we can't just dismiss. I argue that we can't just dismiss Challenger as an insufferable fool. He is, as a scientist, he's totally vindicated by the novel. As I said, he brings back the proof, absolutely incontrovertible truth, and there's a huge triumphal procession at the end of the novel. Challenger is the hero. He's the intrepid scientist. There's no way we can just dismiss him as the joke of the novel. He's not, or at least not of the tale of the novel. So argument is actually that if the novel is not making fun of Challenger, I'm going to argue that it's actually us, the readers, in the nicest possible way, so that we don't notice and we're not upset. The novel is actually making fun of us. And why do I say this? Is if we look at this exchange at the beginning of the novel, before they go on the expedition and bring back the proof, we look at this exchange between one Dr. Illingworth and one Professor Challenger. Okay, Challenger saying, well, I did have proof of the dinosaurs, but they got lost. And Illingworth, of course, says, we don't believe you. And in any case, even if you had pictures, they wouldn't convince us. And Professor Challenger says you would require to see the thing itself. And Dr. Illingworth answers undoubtedly. And Professor Challenger says, and you would accept that. And Dr. Illingworth, laughing, says, beyond a doubt. But of course, it's Challenger that has the last laugh, because he brings the thing itself. And Illingworth is forced to accept it and humiliated. But what I want to say is that, hand on heart, surely, if we'd been there in the hall when Illingworth is with this altercation with Challenger, we would have been totally on Illingworth's side. We'd have said, sure, we don't believe you either, bring us proof. Illingworth is our representative. We are trained in exactly the same way. So if the evidence is flung in Illingworth's face at the end of the novel, it's, so to say, also flung in our faces. But why? I think the answer that I propose has to do with distinguishing between two types of science and recognizing that Challenger, a distinguished scientist as he is a representative of one particular kind of science. But also at the same time, there is this kind of science, this formula which appears just before the novel appears. Okay, and what is the point here? Why am I showing you this formula? It represents a very different kind of science. And I've taken this point from Jacques Lacan, and who's a psychoanalyst, who's also interested in this question of science, because of course psychoanalysis is banished as being not scientific. Both Freud and Lacan are kind of banished from the realm of science because they cannot bring proof or evidence of the type accepted by empirical science. So what Lacan claims, is that that actually modern science, and which he said starts with Galileo, is something different from empirical science. Modern science has nothing to do with what one sees. Okay, modern science changes the way one sees the world. It manipulates symbols, usually mathematical ones, and it produces something which has no connection with how that reality appeared before the manipulation of symbols. And I think to make this idea much clearer, we go back to Descartes, who compared two ideas of the sun. He simply said, there's the sun I see with my eyes. That sun is very small. And there's the sun that is produced by astronomical reasonings, i.e. mathematical work. And this sun is several times greater than Earth. It's not what I see. And he says these two ideas of the sun cannot indeed both resemble the same sun. And it's reason that makes me believe that the one which seems to have originated directly from the sun itself is the one which is most dissimilar to it, i.e. what I see is not the truth or is not the right idea of the sun. And that was Descartes. So what I'm saying is that we have to bear in mind two different conceptions of science. Okay, we have the manipulation of the symbolic as we do in mathematics and modern physics, with a disregard for what appears to be existing reality. And we have empirical science which tends to simply refine what it already knows. Challenger in the book finds what he's looking for. He knows that there are dinosaurs on that plateau because he's seen sketches of it, sketches of them by, and he believes in the sketches, by an explorer that unfortunately died. Okay, so what we have, going back to the end of 19th century Britain, we do have a kind of pride in, and it's in the letters in the newspaper about the new scientific area and the decline of believing authorities such as religious authorities. But I think what the Lost World is saying, or one of the many things that it's talking about, is that this kind of, the fact that we no longer accept the word of an authority without challenging it is not necessarily the great step forward that we assume if it's replaced with the demand for a specific kind of incontrovertible hard evidence, and in particular that the idea that what we see with one's own eyes is what counts. And I put it in small writing, but Illingworth's humiliation is ours insofar as we also don't distinguish between science, modern science, the Galilean type, and empirical science, which demands evidence. Okay, so finally, if we go back to modern science and its disregard for what appears to be existing reality, it doesn't care. It just does the mathematical game, and whatever comes out according to the rules of mathematics and the manipulation of symbols turns into the new reality. And in fact, this is exactly what literature does. It invents new worlds which don't exist. It invents new symbols and ways of seeing and ways of concept, which, if we don't try to interpret them in accordance with what we already know, should open up new ways of seeing and new conceptions of our reality. That is, it changes our reality. Lacan also does that. He invents new concepts, new symbols, which bring a new reality into being. And again, to go back to Professor Clausen's talk, which I think is also, if I understood correctly, it's saying that we as in this tale, there's a wonderful tale that has a very satisfactory ending and it's very enjoyable, but in a way it's the sugar-coated pill that we swallow in order to face in Conan Doyle's art questions that in the case of Sherlock Holmes, it was questions of justice and injustice that are beyond the reach or treatment of the empirical scientific method, and that are much more challenging. They don't have easy answers, and you can't really bring the methods of empirical science to as any kind of proof.
Hi, Josephine. I
Yeah.
hear from the alarm clock. Was that the conclusion of your paper? Just wanted to confirm
Yeah,
it was.
that was my
Yeah, thank
20
you.
minutes.
Thank you. That was
Good.
really interesting stuff, and yeah, indeed, all the papers were really interesting, and speaking across a range of disciplines. And I would like to immediately ask our audience if perhaps Elizabeth and Lowell, could you turn your screen back on and join us? That would be great if you could. But does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Please alert me in the chat or raise your hand. And I will give you all a few moments to do so.
I'm not going to be able to hear.
Okay, well, in the meantime, I will ask a question to Christine, if I may. Thanks very much for your paper. It was really interesting, and you were it is very interesting on the sort of forensic use of deployment of blood in Conan Doyle's fiction and the Holmes stories particularly. And apologies, I haven't formulated this question very well, but I'll try to make it a question. Is in your opinion, was Conan Doyle using blood or deploying it in his fiction in a purely forensic way? And I'm thinking that he's a doctor, so possibly he's more, inured to gruesomeness than most people. Or was he also using blood for its sort of fictional grand guignol, like punctum, if that's the right word, I'm not sure, but just to titillate the audience through gruesomeness and to use sort of horror tropes, basically. So I guess it's a question of genre as much as anything. Or what was his use of blood there, do you think, in terms of genre? Or was he doing both things at once?
I would say he's doing both things at once. Initially in Study in Scarlet, I think he's very much using that to try to establish Holmes' type of detection, right? Because that's something that very quickly he could set that up and show how he's more expert than your average policeman. But by the time we have all those stories where in really rapid succession, it's blood, 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 blood. I think that's definitely about the storytelling and trying to shock the readers entirely. And the thing that he's always doing, he could be more accurate and more precise with the medical stuff. He's got the knowledge to do that. But as soon as he gets too technical, he's going to lose the readers. So he has to be very careful in having enough in there so that it shows he knows what he's doing and it shows how intelligent Holmes is. But then he also has to sort of back off and make sure that the readers don't pick this up and say, well, this is so dense, this is like a textbook, I need to just stop reading this and go find something that's more accessible, right? So he's doing all of those things at the same time, and the medical professionals love to call him out when he makes a mistake, like they did with the color with the crimson. And I did check after the talks yesterday about all the different editions to see if it got fixed later, and even in a 2020 version it still says crimson for that. It hasn't been changed to say a different shade of red. And there's one where he says a character is, it's not about blood, but a character is short-sighted and has convex lenses. And so someone calls him out on that and says, no, if you had convex lenses, that would mean you were far-sighted, not short-sighted, and so on. So they love to catch him on that. But I think he's doing that, or maybe his editor's doing that, to say, people think blood, think red, think crimson, just go with it. As opposed to trying to describe it in the way they should have, because most people probably haven't seen a human blood stain that's dried after several days and been sitting under a rug. So he's doing some of that in the midst of it.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Sheldon, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I have a question for Lowell and Elizabeth, because I've been thinking of clues and objects, and I was trying to think, I mean, maybe this doesn't apply to every Sherlock Holmes story, because The Man with the Twisted Lip is the story I was talking about, and I can't think of an object that prompts the solution. Holmes sits on a pile of pillows and smokes a lot of tobacco, and that overnight, and then suddenly realizes, that's the solution. I was wrong before. This is another example where at first he's really off base. And then he figures it out just through meditation, like a Buddha. So I'm wondering how that fits in with the theory of objects. And they're muted, I think.
I think I was going to say, Sheldon, that you pointed out the stories in which Holmes does not arrive at the conclusion, and I think that we're looking more at the ones that when he does. So I think that that's a very good point, and I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that, but I think there are, you know, it varies the canon when there are stories where Holmes has more difficulty arriving at the conclusion.
Yeah, I would say similarly, he misses the boat to a certain extent in Scandal in Bohemia because he's outwitted by the woman, and he doesn't see things in quickly enough in that story to be able to achieve what he had originally hoped to. Although, as it turns out, he's happy that she gets away because it turns out that the king is more of a rotter than she is, and so. But it's interesting what seems frequently in the stories to be instantaneous on his part. He says there is time, that it usually goes by in an instant, but there are steps that I have to follow, and in that case, he's too slow.
It's also a problem, and this was what was mainly in my mind for the whole thing about transformational clues. It's a problem when people get locked in to one single view, and they come to a conclusion about the whole story before they even look at the evidence. And I think it's that's an interesting point that's made throughout all these stories about the danger of being locked into a single view. Certainly for scientists, which I think the other two papers brought out the scientific point of perspective on things very well.
It's a danger for literary critics too.
That's true. That's true.
Thank you. Douglas, you have your hand raised.
You can mute us.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hog the questions, but I find all three of these papers really fascinating. My question also is for Elizabeth and Lowell. It has to do with reading. I really liked your presentation. I thought it was very elegant. And I like the way you sort of, one of you, as it were, speaks for Holmes and the other for Watson, in a way. So a clue is a mystery. It seems to involve a kind of hiding. That is, that the rabbit is hidden in the duck, and the duck is hidden in the rabbit, and the inheritor is hidden in the ancestor, and so on. You seem to be describing a process whereby Holmes strips things away. He digs through things and discards them. Facts, some facts should be suppressed, and he discloses the meaning. And then Watson comes along and kind of reburies it. He returns all the texture to cover it up again. My question is, all right, that's two phases. In the third phase, what is the reader doing? I mean,
Yeah, one of the things I was going to say, this is where what we had to say, at least a little bit, what I had to say, overlapped with what Sheldon had to say, which is that Watson's voice is crucial to the stories. And in fact, one of the disadvantages of the movies is that it immediately more or less creates a third person omniscient narrative. And the stories themselves depend on Watson's sort of playing out bit by bit what it is that we learn and what it is what we know. Holmes would delight in simply a block that reveals in one instant what he has understood, but nobody would want to read them. And whenever Doyle includes in his stories an account from a newspaper or some other type of narrative or prose, not narrative usually, they're never very interesting. We get in The Hound of the Baskervilles, we read the newspaper account of Charles Baskerville's death, but it's not interesting in the way that the novel is interesting. And for that, we need Watson's voice, and we need Watson's hiding again, as you say, what Holmes has revealed, and then playing it out bit by bit by bit, so that there's Doyle is a master of creating suspense, and of course he puts that suspense more or less in Watson's hands, since he's the one narrating them.
Yeah, please, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just going to say, as we've thought together through this whole approach to clues, I think the Watson and Doyle and Holmes pairing unites a scientific approach and a more humanistic approach or something, and those are very hard to bring together. And I think that's why it's so brilliant to have the two different characters interacting with each other. I have to say, you know, as a literature person, I find scientific papers impenetrable. I can't read them at all. And like Lowell says, it's Watson that's pulling that science in and making it readable, and the whole scientific perspective on things is represented in a way that non-scientists can understand.
Yeah, though it strikes me that with the description you're giving of the stories, which seems to me a very good one, actually, that surely leads to a sort of double function of reading. Because when we read, of course, we're enjoying Watson's narrative for the reasons that you say, the humanistic reasons that make us enjoy stories. But at the same time, with another part of the brain, perhaps, we're trying to act the Holmes part and to say, well, this is a false clue, this is irrelevant, this is a false trail. We want to concentrate on this, the bell pull, and that's going to tell us the story. So in a way, we're doing both at the same time. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why I have to say I really enjoyed the other two papers, which were more focused on the science a little more. And I think raises the question for me. Sometimes I wonder if scientists actually see the world in a different way from the way I see it. If their whole vision isn't somehow different, you know, they're looking at blood spatters and seeing something entirely other from what I'm seeing. So.
Well, if they do see the world differently, it seems to me that that different way of seeing the world or expressing what it is that they see was really developing precisely at the time Doyle was writing. Because if you read Darwin writes more like a humanist than like a scientist in a lot of ways. There's narrative in The Origin of Species, and his journals of the Beagle are wonderful in that way. And it's really a 20th century development that science develops the cold Holmesian approach to presenting evidence. It's not something that was traditionally the way. It's something that's a development in the 20th century where scientists, for the most part, speak to scientists rather than to a public. And so what Watson does, it seems to me, is he has a rhetorical sense to understand that, as you said, Doug, that writing has to, at least according to, is it Ovid, Horace, that writing needs to instruct and delight. And Holmes can instruct, but he doesn't delight until Watson makes him a character worth knowing.
Thank you both.
Simon, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I don't mean to pile in too much on the questions, but I just wondered, given my interest in the Lost World, if I could invite Josephine to comment on exactly this issue, because hearing the papers together makes me think about there is a difference in the science, that Sherlock Holmes's science underpins everyday life, that you think that something might be merely epiphenomenal, but actually it's tobacco ash or a bloodstain, which shows you a hidden meaning in everyday life. Whereas the science in the Lost World is actually completely different, isn't it? That you might think that this is the bone of a giant bird, but not. It's actually, it really is the bone of a dinosaur, or so on too. That actually the science points towards something completely hermetic and something completely non-quotidian. And I wonder if, with all, I know so little about Conan Doyle's spiritualism, but I wonder if that might be the reason behind this kind of epistemic shift in Conan Doyle's understanding of science in between the two sets of stories. But I wonder if you had any thoughts on that. Oh, you're muted, I think.
I think that the Challenger's science is Conan Doyle is actually very critical of. I think that there's and that's why he comes out as, because otherwise why would Challenger be compared to this ape man? And the way he's portrayed, when there's a physical description of him, he's a very odd looking man, and that sets up for the fact that he can be compared to the ape man. The ape man is kind of the opposite of what we'd expect Challenger to be. Challenger is a professor of science with a lot of letters after his name, and what's the connection between this ape man who's a completely sadistic, uncivilized, he can barely speak, they have some kind of proto-language, and so the question is, why does Challenger get compared, and why is he set up as being this kind of double of the ape man? And I think it is a criticism of his kind of science. I think the fact that he just is the fact that this science is a naming science, that they know how to name everything, and they know how to find something that they already know exists, and that they bring back proof, the kind of proof that you can see with your eyes, is for Conan Doyle a very problematic kind of science. And I think he's and it's that we shouldn't hold it up as the gold standard to which all kind of say psychoanalysis or psychology or even literature should conform to, or and this kind of science still goes on a lot in social sciences, and it's held up as in biology, in this kind of science where basically you're finding what you set out to find. You're not really inventing anything new, and you're bringing very kind of dubious evidence. You're renaming things. And then when literature or something can't conform to this standard, we find ourselves having to defend literature. And I think this Lost World is pointing out it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be our gold standard. It's very problematic. It's and this is the explanation why Challenger, who is compared to this ape man, it's going backwards. It's a step backwards. It's not the step forward that we imagine it to be. It's not the pinnacle of civilization. It's basically not the right kind of science, which I think is different from Sherlock Holmes kind of science, which does have to do more with interpretation, which already is a different kettle of fish. You can't just point to a bell cord and say what it is. It does require basically interpretation, which is what literature does, and readers of literature do. It's not just pointing to something and naming it. It's an act of interpretation, which is already requires a lot more than the simple naming, or it requires context, it requires argument, okay, and interpretation. You can never say for sure whether it's correct or not. And so, yeah, I think it's two different types of science, but the Challenger science is Conan, or the text that Conan Doyle writes, is very critical of it.
Thank you so much. I'm now thinking of W.B. Yeats railing against the climatologist John Tyndall for. He said that Yeats was saying that it was poets who should describe why the sky is blue, not scientists, and Tyndall had just scientifically explained why the sky was blue. Yeats was absolutely livid about that. We've got to leave the things there. Thank you so much to all four panelists. That was really excellent. Thank you. And we've still got time to take a very, very quick break before the closing keynote, when Professor Christine Ferguson will be rejoining us. So let's take a quick 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Sorry,
James.
Douglas, were you going to say something?